So we're back and with Alec. We have a very special guest. This is Alexandra Mousavizadeh, who is the co-founder, co-CEO of Evident, which if you're in the financial services space and or in the AI space, you know who Evident is. And for all of those reasons and then some, I am so happy to welcome you, Alexandra, to the AI with Alec podcast. Thank you for taking the time.
Alec, thank you for having me on. And you did not butcher my name. It was
Tried so
perfect.
hard.
Yeah, well done.
Yeah, well, it's a lovely name, and I'm terrible at names, and I'm working so hard on it. And my wife, who's an extraordinary podcaster, world class, is the best at it. So I constantly have this North Star of trying to live up to the Julia LaRoche expectation. So let's move right into it. I think one of the things that I've always noticed about the research that you all publish, as someone who loves all things AI, of course, is how valuable it is, how tight and accurate it is. And then I always wonder the origin story because I don't recall if either of you or both of you, the co-founders and co-CEOs, have a management consulting background. But I want to give you a chance to help the audience understand what is Evident, and then let's maybe step into the context of how and when you all built it and why.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's I'll start with when we built it. We set it up about 3 years ago, and it was in motion. And we established the company before ChatGPT was released in November 22. So there was prior to setting up Evident, I had built the Global AI Index, which was a measurement of national AI ecosystems, looking at, who's strongest, the US or China, or and where does Singapore and UK and Canada and Germany and France fit in, and really getting into the weeds of how you measure something as nebulous as AI development and deployment. And so there was a growing interest from the financial services in particular, because they were like, hey, we spend billions every year on, technology, and some of it emerging technology, and a bigger proportion of that is going to AI and the like. And came to me and said, listen, you've got this framework for nations. Can you potentially build something for us financial services? And I remember I remember chuckling a bit, thinking, well, it's quite audacious to rank the biggest banks in the world on where they sit on their AI performance, that being so existential to sort of future growth and growth of market share and cost of delivery. But I also thought that we were probably the team that were deepest in the weeds of understanding how to measure AI. And so it became clear that this was definitely something there was a need for. So, and a need to create a bit more transparency around, where is it being used and how, and what's the impact of those AI dollars invested. And so we built the methodology. It took us about 9 months, and released it literally at the same time as ChatGPT got released. And I would love to claim that we saw it all coming, but we didn't really. We knew it was intensifying. Transformer models were moving in a direction where they could probably be more helpful, but that sort of ChatGPT moment in November 22 was not something we sort of had in our timeline. But it was an interesting moment, because the minute that was released, you're moving from AI being really powerful for part of the bank to AI being, or financial service, or any enterprise for that matter, to AI being really important for the entirety of every workflow and every nook and cranny. And so hence the topic of, wait, what is our AI strategy, and how are we executing it, went to the top of every meeting, at pretty much every level, but particularly at the CEO board level and at the sort of CTO, CIO level. And sort of there we were with a ranking of the biggest banks at that time. And now we've expanded to cover insurance companies, which we released in June. We're rolling out our payment platform ranking in Q1, as also we're rolling out our ranking of asset managers, while we're also going deeper and deeper into the benchmarking and getting really into the sort of weeds of all of the what is a state of the art architecture of a tech platform, and what does that look like. But I know we're going to get into that, but so I'll stop there.
No, I love it, and I I want to say thank you on behalf of all of us that are either directly or indirectly involved in the financial services and the finance industry as a whole. It's not an industry that's known necessarily to be as open and sharing about the types of indexing that is incredibly valuable, which is why, and we will get to it for sure, but the 2025 AI banking index that you all put together was just phenomenal. And I have so many questions that I want to ask, and I'll try not to ask too many because I want to let you go in any direction you want to go with it. But I think to kind of jump into it, there are some folks that believe that those that are leading in AI today, such as I'll just say it, you don't to agree, but I think JP Morgan's been at it for a long time and doing a great job, and others, and those that are behind, that gap is something that folks need to really think about closing rather quickly because of the magic of compounding and the potential for, we'll use the E word, existential stuff. So my question for you, just off the jump, is in your experience to date, have you seen those gaps widening? Have you seen them closing? And what role does AI native talent play in all of that?
Yes, well, absolutely. And I think, you caught sort of one of the sort of key results of the 2025 index that we launched in October, or we released in October, which was exactly that. What we're seeing is this, ramp up and acceleration in the banks that are at the top of the index. That flywheel effect of, as you pointed out, starting early, being, having the right talent for execution to build the platforms that enables and AI enables the rest of the company. And, the constant iteration of the operating model to, putting in place a culture of uptake and all of those things that have to be there for adoption, to deployment to pick up pace, but also moving from point solutions to scale and the architecture that's needed to underpin that. So that's what the leading banks are doing, and that flywheel effect is definitely something we're seeing. And that's sort of they're moving, they're moving at triple, quadruple speed now than the rest of the banks in the index and sort of and beyond. And so they're just pulling ahead, and the gap between the leading banks and the lagging banks is just growing
Mhm.
really fast. And so you do, one should ask oneself, at what point in time is it going to be difficult or impossible to keep up? And it's not just, everyone's spending on technology. That doesn't go away. Most are spending a growing proportion on AI. But if you haven't really sort of started, or you're very slow, or you're hitting, roadblocks and bumps and not addressing them head on, and you're just sort of slowing that pace of adoption down, that can become a real problem very, very soon, because that flywheel effect that we're seeing is suddenly we're actually seeing real ROI, and there's real impact showing up. There's real impact, especially sort of on productivity and efficiency gains, where banks, and we're sort of mainly talking about banks here, able to take some cost out, revenue uplift. We're seeing these use cases come into production that can lift revenue. And so you've got these leading banks that are just able to do so much more with the same or with less, and the cost of delivery is coming down already, and we're still really early days. And and customer satisfaction scores are increasing and so on. And it just makes it so much harder for the banks that are not able to take cost out, who are not able to do more with what they have, or provide a better, more seamless customer experience. It's just they're just slowing down their growth, and we can see that. They're hiring fewer people across the board and not enough AI talent. So we definitely see this gap between the leading and the lagging banks growing. And so we try to put a timeline on, when is it going to be impossible to keep up? And I think it's sort of, it's about 2 to 3 years out, when that flywheel effect of the leading banks have really kicked in and agentic AI use cases are really in flow. That is going to suddenly hit a tipping point where the growth is exponential.
I could not agree with you more. I might be even more aggressive on the timeline, the 2 to 3 years. I might even pull that in a little bit, but I completely agree with you across the board. The question I'm going to ask, and I have no idea how you're going to answer this, and I don't know that there's a right answer or a wrong answer, but generally speaking, we can always think of, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And, as much as this is obviously a major platform shift, some could call it even bigger than that. Um, People, process, and technology, right? They work together. Clearly, the technology has raced so far ahead of so many institutions, potentially their understanding, but certainly their implementation execution. So the question I have for you is, how would you advise or speak to, let's say, a new CEO of a laggard who is, by definition, he or she is quite technical and obviously sophisticated on all sorts of fronts, but how does that person and that leadership team identify the gaps? I'm not really talking about the technical gaps. What I'm talking about is it's not, nobody would question that there's something really exciting and wild going on. But what is it about these leaders that have enabled them to put together the people, process, and technology bit so much better than perhaps the laggards? And what do you think the solution might look like?
Yeah, I mean, what sets the leaders apart? I mean, the banks that are really leading out front, right? And then, by the way, just maybe to say that it's not just the big banks. I mean, sure,
Yeah,
JP Morgan is number one, and for those of our listeners here who don't know who's leading the pack here, JP Morgan is number one, followed by a much smaller bank, which is Capital One, right?
they're
And so
gnarly. Love Capital
they're
One.
tiny, but they
They're
are,
gnarly.
and then you've got banks there in the top 10, pretty, dominated by the North American banks and US in particular. But there are a couple of European banks, UBS and HSBC.
Mhm.
But what the sort of JP Morgan, Capital One, Goldman Sachs, and so on have in common, and RBC to be,
Mhm.
they're also sitting up there in the top of the index, is a sort of a relentlessness from this senior leadership and the CEOs that are really picking up on this being absolutely existential and spending every waking hour almost, right, on thinking about, you know, that they need to understand what the technology can do without being technologists. You
Mhm.
do see in some of the cases that you've got engineers as CEOs who just are thinking about it from a engineering problem, which is very handy because if you're trying to completely system rethink and rewire an organization, it's an engineering mindset is great to have. You don't need to be an engineering background CEO to really push it hard. You get that sense that their CEO is like constantly messaging their CIO and CTO and CDAO. I saw this model and what's the latest, and how far are we in this, and pushing the organization to set an ambitious strategy, to think about scale, to have many people in the executive committee accountable for the rollout and the KPIs that are set. The things you also see is like, don't do a strategy and let it sit for a year. Constantly go back to it. And most successful, rollouts and banks that are doing this really well will go back to it all the time, every week, every month. I know we set this target. Are we actually ahead? Let's reset it. Let's rethink it. They don't use necessarily, decks and PowerPoints for when they're looking at how far they are. They pull in their own dashboards. I need to see dashboard on uptake, on rollout. I need to see dashboards from all of the lines of business where we've got use cases rolling out. And I want that a full understanding of how the full platform architecture is being built, because without that, we can't really get to scale. And so if you've got a CEO and your senior leadership team asking those questions all the time, it tends to trickle down. And then I think that the sort of onus has been really passed. So that's the sort of first aspect, and it's really been passed down to the managing level, right? So heads of lines of business are suddenly given a remit that is completely new. They've never had this before, because suddenly they don't only have their financial KPIs in their on their desk, right, they've also got an AI KPI. And in many cases, they've been given, you've got to cut 15% of your staff and you've got to figure out how to do that with AI, or the other way around. We've set some AI KPIs for you and your bonus is going to be dependent on that. So part of this is figuring out how does it land best in your organization. How much carrot, how much stick do we have to deploy here? But I think the most important thing is that it is made absolutely 100% clear that this is not optional, that this is absolutely, this is do or die. And actually, if you don't want to, work on what the AI version of your task, your function, or your line of business is, typically it would be, then you need to find somewhere else to work. So, I mean, that's what we see. So it's a very hard push from the top, and it's allowing a super hard push from the bottom as well. You need to let a lot of ideas flourish. But at that said, what we're really seeing being sort of a differentiator now is this question of the platform and building the architecture for the one platform where you've got your data at the base, and it could be on-prem or in the cloud, right? It doesn't, whatever your sort of legacy systems are, have produced, but you've got to have it on one platform. Many banks are struggling with data everywhere. And then you've got your model layers. And it's, some use a mix of open source and commercial. Some have said we're actually not using open source, or vice versa. And then you've got your, your agents, right, and your agentic layer, your context windows, and then you've got that, that's got to pass up through every vertical of the bank. So you've got to figure out how you do that last mile. And there are lots of different ways to get to that platform. Some want to build it in-house. Some can, with the support of there are very few vendors who can do this. And so you've got to work with those who can. And then it's a question of how you do that really hard graft of the last mile. But I think that is sort of, if you ask what the sort of common denominator of the leading banks' current sort of thinking is, how do we get to platform? And how do we move to that platform use as quickly as possible? And how do we do that last mile bit?
Yeah, that is a very thorough and exact explanation. And I agree with you across the board. I think the question that I imagine our audience might have, because it's been pretty well documented generally, and I know it's a questionable, amount of data that went into it, but there's this conversation around this MIT study that was published, I think, a couple months back now, where, hey, 95% of AI pilots are failing, and so on and so forth. And without getting into the merits of it, I do think that it caused a lot of people to have a lot of conversations about, how do you step into AI pilots or POCs and convert them rather consistently to production and scale? And do we think about pilots and POCs, or do we think about a phased approach? What's the role of longer term planning versus bottoms up and iterative? And just given, what you just unpacked, and I love the way that Evident came to be, right in and around the time that all this Chat GPT explosion also took place. I know the industry's changed and evolved a lot in terms of the comfort level with AI, but I wonder if you have any thoughts on the relationship between pilots and POCs and getting to production and scale, and the role of bottoms up versus more longer term planning within finance.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we're in a phase where it's probably the death of the end of point solution, because point solution is just creating, it's creating a mess, right? It's just creating fragmented solutions that are not tied up. But I think the biggest issue with this point solution, which many banks are in, right, and they're using all sorts of different types of solution providers that can solve a particular issue over here. And then you try and have some agents lying across that, and you've got an absolute nightmare from a risk perspective, because the risk sneaks in through fragmentation, right? And you don't, the right way, or I mean, who am I to say that? But I think the sort of the way that most of the leading banks are thinking about it is that you really need to think about the agent as a employee almost, because then you can build those guardrails around that particular agent that is doing a particular task. And while it is, going out to other agents and providing what it needs to provide to the other agents, and it's all, you can easily have autonomous systems while thinking about the agent sort of in an atomized basis. But that you've got to do for the sake of the risk profile of your system, because if you are looking at that agent and creating guardrails around that particular agent, you eliminate, not completely, but you reduce the risk. And so having point solutions that are sort of, all over the place and not tied together, that really does, potentially introduce a risk factor that no bank wants to have. And so the sort of the question about how you leap from, use case focus, individual POCs, point solutions, that to sort of a one platform where it's all streamlined, that's where you've got a lot of the banks working on at both at the same time and sort of transitioning onto sort of one platform. And so, so that transition, not every, many banks haven't started that at all because they're sort of still sort of figuring out, selecting what to focus on, low hanging fruit, sort of where can we have some impact right away, what do we call table stakes use cases, and sort of focusing on that in the first instance to create sort of a case for more investment and more focus from the board. But I think the sort of, when you've got your executive committee and your CEO understanding that this is actually full-on transformation and we need to get to that platform build as quickly as possible, those banks are doing both at the same time. Yes, we need to sort of keep the momentum going. We need to just think long-term and think platform and start to sort of weed out the point solutions that can be solved in our one platform. And so you're just sort of, you're walking and chewing gum at the same time, pretty much. But sort of that is the transition that is going on now. And sort of, again, the mark of maturity is who has a platform or who's building a platform right now.
Yes, absolutely. And I think a follow-on question is the idea of agents, digital labor, what have you, and their collaboration in, with humans and augmentation, for example. And I wonder if you could maybe provide a little bit of perspective on the way that some of the leaders or otherwise in your experience are thinking about deploying agents and or multi-agent frameworks to automate dimensions of work that machines are effectively better at, for all sorts of obvious reasons. And then the other side of it, how they're standing up agents to augment and enhance and provide superpowers essentially to the human beings, so that the same human being, can now produce 3, 5x or more output in very, determined and advanced territories that are mission critical to the business.
Yeah, I think the latter question first, if okay. I think
Yeah,
this
please.
question of super sort of there's obviously, artificial general intelligence, the AGI aspect, which is, when do those capabilities surpass human capabilities? And as we know, there's like 3 races going on, right? There's a geopolitical race, who's going to win, China or the US, and that, that will, China is better on some things and the US on others. So there's that race, and then there's the race for AGI, right? Which one of the big platforms are going to create AGI? I would say we probably have already reached it. Like if you take the Turing test as the passing point, so we've probably passed it. And so I think, or we never reach it because there'll always be, the next level of capability that you can build. But on the other hand, when you're talking enterprise adoption, and that's the third race, and in my view, probably the most important race there is, because, US, China will always sort of be neck and neck. You will always, AGI will probably always remain a bit elusive. But what's not elusive and what's really real is like if you are, enterprise adoption is where economic growth is developed, right? You create capacity to grow at a company and at a national level, right? So helping unlock the capability and the ability of enterprises in your country to adopt swiftly and adopt well and adopt safely is really the most important thing. And so then it's like the how, like, and what are the enterprises doing? And that's where our index obviously comes in and looks at like who's leading and who's lagging and why. But sort of to get to your point about, that superhuman capability that's there to augment. Now, I think, as the capabilities are increasingly getting better, there's still mainly, still for now at least, really, really moving into areas that is augmenting the work that we do. In most cases, an employee has several tasks and it's helping them do one of them better. And most of the cases that we see, whether it's in wealth management or investment banking or in capital markets or sort of pretty much anywhere, that would be, the setup that's built for enhancing analysts and document, ingestion and understanding, putting sort of 300 legal documents into a system that can maybe chew them through a bit easier for an IPO or for an M&A, transaction. That's just taking, a small part of what that analyst does in terms of the entirety of the IPO, transaction, or any task, right? So it's freeing up that time, and you'll have data showing, but and I think actually Goldman Sachs was the one that said it took 90% of the time out of that particular task that analyst was doing. So keep in mind that there is, the way that it is being read in the media versus the reality of what it's actually doing are two very different things. And so where we see it really impact is on certain tasks where it's augmenting certain people in some of the work that they do. And then, of course, there are areas that are being taken on by an agent. You've got trade issues every day in every bank. Some of them are human made, some of them are model made, and you now have an agent in most cases that will go and see which ones are model made, pull them out, figure out what the problem is, fix it, put them back in. Someone was doing that as part of their job. They are now, they've now been freed up to not sort of pore over that paperwork and figure out what was the model to send it over to the team that fixes the model. So these are sort of tasks and things that are obviously, where agents and Gen AI can go in and fix and take some of that lift off, is where we're seeing the most impact. And so, as the agents get better, there will be more and more tasks that can be done by agents. But it's slow. It's like relatively slow moving. I mean, I'm saying it's not sort of every month there's a whole work process that's completely changed and eliminates people. So what we're also seeing on this at the same time is that there's enormous amount of new jobs coming up. So the banks that are leaning most into AI are also the banks that are actually hiring, which is kind of funny because, everyone's talking about AI is taking my job. Actually, it's not the case in our data. The banks that are leaning into AI the most are the ones that are growing their market share, becoming better banks, hiring more people to serve more people. And while, I know that a lot of, there are areas that are being cut down, there are more areas and new areas that are springing up. So just like when we look back at the time of the internet and everyone had the same concerns and there was a lot of doom and gloom and you could, buy weapons online and 3D printing and you can print a gun and everything's going to be mayhem, is end of the world as we know it, and education is going to be ruined because you can Google stuff and and sort of exactly the same things that are being said today were said back then. But and the jobs one was a big one. OECD came out with endless reports on 80% of white collar work would be gone by the year 2002 or whatever it was they were saying, which obviously didn't happen. And so now if you look back at some of the studies done by Harvard and Stanford, you'd see, in the in that internet age, right, for 1 million jobs that were lost, 4.7 were gained. And I think there is an argument in what we're seeing unfold that we probably will be facing something quite similar. What we do see, however, is that the banks that don't lean into AI are actually the ones that are cutting and cutting staff, just because balance sheets are a bit more complicated because they're not able to grow their market share and deliver services with as much ease as the banks that are leaning in. So there's definitely going to be disruption. It's just not the way that it's typically talked about, in my view.
I'm 1,000% with you, which is in large part why I was, so excited to have you on here as someone who has so much signal and so much data to work with and to speak about. And I think people really deserve to hear that element of it. And I really appreciate that. I want to go a little bit further into this. So some people refer to jobs as bundles of tasks. And let's just say, hypothetically speaking, a good percentage of those tasks today and or in the future can get handled more so by the digital labor and the agents and so on and so forth. And if you believe in, I believe it's referred to as Pareto's principle, the 80-20 rule, what have you, is 20% of our effort generates 80% of results, generally speaking. And so I wonder, let's take the optimistic glass half full perspective supported by the data of the high performers. What do you think about when you think about the future and the optimistic scenario of 6, 12, 18 months out? You got, hundreds of billions of dollars of CapEx going into improving all of this infrastructure. How do you think knowledge workers' role within finance is going to continue to flourish in conjunction with these wildly, capable machines? And how does that drive value creation, new jobs, and what have you? I think that's such an interesting territory that maybe you could shed some light on, for sure.
Yeah, I think it's such an exciting time to be someone working within the banks in a knowledge working role, because you suddenly have so much more at your fingertips, right? You look at the sort of the platforms that are built in the banks that give you access to to sort of pretty much do everything and anything, any piece of analysis that you want. If you're on the equity research side, right, what would take you 5 days of looking at like, some company earnings calls and like trying to digest that can be done so much faster and probably better now without mistakes. And that just leaves you with time to ask the trickier questions and pull in more third-party data or other data to say, well, hang on a second, what if this happened? You can start really building interesting scenarios. You can start really extrapolating out what you think your predictions might be. You've got more data at your fingertips to ask questions that you just couldn't ask before. And so I think this notion, and I'm sort of paraphrasing Reid Hoffman a bit here, but sort of very much agree with that. And just from working with AI all the time, is that when you go on to one of the AI LLM providers, and you want to interrogate something, you're now allowed to just go deeper and deeper, and it's like talking to sort of a very wise, professor or expert in that field, right? And so instead of mucking around on Google and trying to find, and read around and like think about, maybe you can just go on and on. So this notion of it removes the method of thinking, I think, is completely wrong. I think it increases the method of thinking, because you can then ask the next question, and then you read that answer and it prompts you to think even deeper. And then it prompts you to say, well, hang on, how about we just twist it this way and we added this data, something you'd never be able to do before. You suddenly can do it, right? So actually, being a knowledge worker, this is amazing, right? So it allows you to be super creative and think about dimensions you've never been able to draw in before, and probably create much better thinking for your customers, for your boss, for the business as a whole. So and if you do a really good job, right, you acquire more clients, right? Because they're like, hey, they've got an amazing platform. The analysts are good, but the platform is so good, it's making the analysts amazing. I'm going to, put more money with them, or I'm going to tell a friend. And, you already see that's really impacting the sort of the market, the market share acquisition. Is down to, it is at the end of the day, how good is that platform, because it makes your analysts really brilliant.
Without a doubt, because it becomes smarter every time this intelligent infrastructure interacts with humans and other forms of interaction, and we can get into probabilistic software and all sorts of things with the LLMs being able to enable capabilities that weren't necessarily possible before, which is so amazing and awesome. I want to give you some time and some space to talk about a little bit of that expansion and some reports that are coming up, that Evident is putting forth beyond, into I heard asset management. And I know my audience stretches across all of finance. And so I'm sure they're going to love hearing more about, where are things headed, let's say in 2026 for Evident, any exciting research reports, areas of focus, events, conferences, summits, you name it. Would love to give you some territory because I'm sure that folks that are watching this are saying, hey, I want more.
No, thank you for asking. Yeah, it's a very exciting year, 2026 for us because having now and we will continue to always rank the 50 largest banks in North America and Europe, and that index will go out. The public index will go out, on an annual basis. But there's been a lot of demand from around the world, so we are going to expand into Asia. So do an Asia-specific bank ranking, the Middle East as well, in addition to Latin America, because there are, there's a lot going on there as well, and those regions are different, right? There's a different operating model, and the data sources that we use are slightly different in the various regions. So they're going to be standalone regional indexes. So that's one. And then, as you might know, we also do a private benchmark with the banks, which doesn't go into the public space, which is where the banks send to us their data on all of their use cases, where in the bank it is down the lines of business, and then the functions, time to production, operating model, how that architecture is coming along, and there's all of the return on investment data as well. What kind of impact is this having? And so we get that from all of the participating banks, and that allows us to really go under the hood and also down the lines of business. So what we're going to be doing on the private benchmark is obviously now banks across the world can participate in that, which is great because then we have some comparisons also in sort of, when banks in the US say, well, what about the Asian model? And, their approach to agents is a bit different, and we'll be able to show exactly what's going on in that area. But it also allows us to go really deep in lines of business. So we're going to do investment banking line of business deep dive behind the scenes in the private data. We're doing capital markets, we're doing asset management, we're doing wealth management, and so on and so forth. And then we're going to expand into, and we've done insurance, and so that will keep on going, and we'll probably expand that as well across outside of North America and Europe. We also do private benchmarking for them. Then we're doing payment platforms, public and private, that we're going to be releasing in Q1. So that's your MasterCards and Visas and PayPals and so on. So that's going to be exciting because they're doing a lot of really interesting stuff. And then we've got asset management that we're going to rank publicly. And of course, also behind the scenes, have a private benchmark option for those who want to participate in that. And so it's a really exciting year because there's well, actually, at one point, I think 2 years ago, we said, yeah, we'll do financial services, and then we're also going to do pharma and manufacturing. And there's so much to do in financial services, and there's so much cooking, and it's so fascinating because you feel that you're sort of right in the center, in the epicenter of where everything to do with enterprise AI deployment actually is happening. And of course, the other sectors are going into and investing in AI, but with the many different challenges in terms of data and in terms of operating model and so on, but also the many types of use cases and challenges that the financial services are really rich and deep. And so that's what we're doing for 26. Of course, we will always be hosting our annual symposium in New York. I think we're actually pinned down our date for mid-October next year that we host at the Shed. And that's really where everyone comes together and discusses, it's a peer-to-peer event, sort of the hand-wringing of, how did we fix that? How did you scale that? What happens on stage is fascinating, but what happens just when everyone steps off is also fascinating because it's really sort of the nuts and bolts of how and what did, just happened. And so that's what we do. But, we also do a lot of when we've got reports that are coming out. We have lots of trackers on use case trackers and so on across the board. When we have a fresh one out, we'll do a virtual roundtable and so on. But yeah, it's we just sort of we stay close to the engine room and report up once in a while when we come up for air. So that's us for next year.
Wow. I know that I am personally beyond stoked to consume all of that. And I know others watching are going to feel the same way. So I want to be cognizant of time here, but kind of last couple questions, or just throw one out. I know lots of people that would probably love to come work at Evident. And so not to just put you out front to do a sales pitch, but what kind of talent are you looking for? And what kind of skill sets are you looking for? And how do folks learn more about how they can get more involved and potentially on your radar, generally speaking?
Oh, yeah. Well, thanks for asking. Actually, we're hiring all the time. We are getting to about 60 people now. We did our Series A in the beginning of the year for the purpose of our ramp up in 26 and 27. And so we're always looking, as you can imagine, right? It's got to be some, people who want to work at Evident have got to be very curious and interested in the space. I mean, I think that goes a long way, but with some technical background and some knowledge of the sector itself is ideal. And we've got a great engineering team building our platforms, making our sort of delivery as seamless as possible, and so on. But a lot of the work that we do is like really thinking
Yeah.
about how this is moving. And so, a lot of our time is thinking about, right, so this is moving at pace. How are we in front of it so we can deliver the best knowledge? We're not a consultancy. We only do data. And so how is it? So, we are data as a service. We're an intelligence platform. So, but what we want to be able to deliver to those who have access to our data is the most informative data set. And so we constantly think about how is this moving? What is changing? And how do we capture it from a data perspective? Because with the data, you're really armed, right? Then a CEO or a CTO or whoever is managing the strategy and the execution at an organization can take the data and say, look, we are lacking here, we're in front here, but we shouldn't fall asleep at the wheel because these others are clipping at our heels on this, and this is what state of the art, should be our North Star, right? It's the data that tells you that. And because we've got because we span so many banks or insurance companies or soon to be asset managers, and also now around the world, that data set is extremely rich. So there's a lot of learnings that come off that. So when we're looking for people, we're looking for people who are just as interested in this as we are, because it's important. It's hard to say what exact skills other than just to, be technical, be interested. Having a background in technology or from financial services is great. Both is ideal. But because this is hard to train for, I mean, nobody has an expertise in this because it's moving as we're speaking. So it's just that sort of level of interest that you need to have, I think.
I love that. I think you also touch on something about curiosity. I think is role and company agnostic in this era that we're in, that also ties back to all the things we just talked about. So I appreciate you saying that, and I think people are really going to be encouraged by the way that you unpack that. And so, you know, anything else that you want to share, Alexandra, before we wrap this up? Because I know that this was an anticipated, kind of interview and conversation. And I want to, make sure I get this thing out. My goal is before Thanksgiving, because folks over here, over there, all love sitting around and consuming this kind of content when things kind of slow down a bit. But I want to make sure I give you some more space in case there's anything else you want to share about Evident, about you, about anything in general. Just have at it, by all means.
Oh, that's so kind. Yeah, I mean, you better get it out before Thanksgiving, because after Thanksgiving, who knows? The
Watch
whole world
out.
might be different,
Yeah.
There might be new models out there that have completely cracked something. Well, we'll see. But I think no, I have no more to add other than maybe just when you you were asking about the team, and maybe just I'm very proud to say that actually we're sending one of our team members to NeurIPS, the academic
Oh,
conference,
okay.
because he has actually had a paper accepted at NeurIPS,
Whoa.
which is no it's no small thing to actually have a paper accepted at NeurIPS.
No, I'd say it's
So
like the Olympics in
it's
that territory.
and I'll give a shout out to Alex Inch, and he will be packing his bags, and he's off to I think it's in San Diego, I think it is this year. But it's
Wow.
no, it just it spans that sort of and he's doing his PhD, but it is sort of we've got everything from that sort of really deep technical capability on our team, sort of all the way to sort of very different areas as well. But as a big shout out to him. We're very proud of him. But I am just very thrilled to Alec to be on your podcast and talk about where the lay of the land is today. The state of enterprise AI adoption is fascinating, and I look to hopefully come back on again at some point, and then we can look at what has happened and these predictions of leading and lagging banks, and existential risk from an enterprise level, not an AI level, sort of where that is at next time we speak.
I would love that. And thank you so much. We would be honored and we will take you up on that for sure. So, Alexandra, thank you again so much for the time and all the knowledge and wisdom. I know the AI with Alec community is going to love it. And enjoy the rest of the day and the week. And I'll talk to you soon.
Thank you so much.
Take care.